Hello, fifth graders. I hope this video finds you well. A reminder, we are reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, and this is the first chapter of our story. Chapter 1, The Riddle House. The villagers of Little Hangleton still called it the Riddle House, even though it had been many years since the Riddle family had lived there. It stood on a hill overlooking the village, some of its windows boarded, tiles missing from its roof, and ivy spreading unchecked over its face. Once a fine-looking manor, and easily the largest and grandest building for miles around, the Riddle House was now damp, derelict, and unoccupied. The little Hangletons all agreed that the house was creepy. Half a century ago, something strange and horrible had happened there. Something that the older inhabitants of the village still liked to discuss when topics for gossip were scarce. The story had been picked over so many times and had been embroidered in so many places that nobody was quite sure what the truth was anymore. Every version of the tale, however, started in the same place, 50 years before. At daybreak, on a fine summer's morning, when the Riddle House had still been kept, well and impressive, and a maid had entered the drawing room to find all 3 riddles dead. The maid had run screaming down the hill to the village and roused as many people as she could. Lying there, with their eyes wide open, cold as ice, still in their dinner things. The police were summoned, and the whole of Little Hangleton had settled and seethed with shock and curiosity and ill-disguised excitement. Nobody wasted their breath pretending to feel very sad about the riddles, for they had been the most unpopular. Elderly Mr. and Mrs. Riddle had been rich, snobbish, and rude, and their grown-up son, Tom, had been even more so. All the villagers cared about what was the identity of their murderer. Plainly, 3 apparently healthy people did not all drop dead of natural causes on the same night. The Hanged Man, the village pub, did a roaring trade that night. The whole village had turned out to discuss the murders. They were rewarded for leaving their firesides when the riddle's cook arrived dramatically in their midst and announced to the sudden silent pub that a man called Frank Bryce had just been arrested. "Frank?" cried several people. "Never!" Frank Bryce was the riddle's gardener. He lived alone in a run-down cottage in the Riddle House grounds. Frank had come back from the war with a very stiff leg and a great dislike of crowds and loud noises, and he had been working for the riddles ever since. There was a rush to buy the cook drinks and to hear more details. "Always thought he was odd," she told the eagerly listening villagers after her 4th sherry. "Unfriendly-like. I'm sure if I've ever offered him a cuppa once, I've offered it 100 times. Never wanted to mix, he didn't." "Ah, now," said a woman at the bar. "He had a hard war, Frank. He likes the quiet life. That's no reason to." "Who else had the key to the back door, then?" barked the cook. "There's been a spare key hanging in the gardener's cottage for as far back as I remember. Nobody forced the door last night. Nobody broke any windows. All Frank had to do was creep up to the big house while they were all sleeping." The villagers exchanged dark looks. "I always thought he had a nasty look about him, right enough," grunted a man at the bar. "War turned him funny, if you ask me," said the landlord. "Told you I wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of Frank, didn't I, Dot?" said an excited woman in the corner. "Horrible temper," said Dot, nodding fervently. "I remember when he was a kid." By the following morning, hardly anyone in Little Hangleton doubted that Frank Bryce had killed the riddles. But over in the neighboring town of Great Hangleton, in the dark and dingy police station, Frank was stubbornly repeating again and again that he was innocent, and that the only person he had seen near the house on the day of the riddle's death had been a teenage boy, a dark-haired and pale boy. Nobody else in the village had seen any boy, and the police were quite sure that Frank had invented him. Then, just when things were looking very serious for Frank, the report on the riddle's bodies came back and changed everything. The police had never read an odder report. A team of doctors had examined the bodies and concluded that none of the riddles had been poisoned, stabbed, shot, strangled, suffocated, or, as far as they could tell, harmed in any way. In fact, the report continued in a tone of unmistakable bewilderment, the Riddles had appeared to be in perfect health. Apart from the fact that they were all dead, the doctors did note, as though determined to find something wrong with the bodies, that each of the Riddles had a look of terror upon his or her face. But as the frustrated police said, whoever heard of 3 people being frightened to death? As there was no proof that the Riddles had been murdered at all, the police were forced to let Frank go. The Riddles were buried in the little Hangleton churchyard, and their graves remained objects of curiosity for a while. To everyone's surprise, and amidst a cloud of suspicion, Frank Bryce returned to his cottage on the grounds of the Riddle house. "As far as I'm concerned, he killed him, and I don't care what the police say," said Dot and the hangman. "And if he had any decency, he'd leave there, knowing as he knows he did it." But Frank did not leave. He stayed to the end of the garden. He stayed to tend the garden for the next family who lived in the Riddle house. And then the next, forever, for neither family stayed for long. Perhaps it was partly because of the way that Frank took to each owner. And there was a nasty feeling about the place, which in the absence of its inhabitants, started to fall to disrepair. The wealthy man who owned the Riddle house these days neither lived there nor put it to use. They said in the village that he kept it for tax reasons, though nobody was very clear as to what these might be. The wealthy owner continued to pay Frank to do the gardening. However, Frank was nearing his 77th birthday now. He was very deaf, his bad leg was stiffer than ever, but he could be seen pottering around the flower beds in fine weather, even though the weeds were starting to creep up on him. Weeds were not the only thing that Frank had to contend with either. Boys from the village made a habit of throwing stones through the windows of the Riddle house. They rode their bicycles over the lawns. Frank worked so hard to keep smooth. Once or twice they broke into the old house for a dare. They knew that old Frank was devoted to the house and the grounds, and it amused them to see him limping across the garden, brandishing with his stick and yelling croakily at them. Frank on his part believed the boys tormented him because, like their parents and grandparents, they thought him a murderer. So when Frank awoke one night in August and saw something very odd up at the house, he merely assumed— sorry guys, my kitty's rubbing on the computer. It was Frank's bad leg that woke him. It was paining him worse than ever in his old age. He got up and limped towards the downstairs kitchen with the idea of refilling his hot water bottle to ease the stiffness in his knee. Standing at the sink, filling the kettle, he looked up at the Riddle house and saw the lights glimmering from the upper windows. Frank knew at once what was going on. The boys had broken into the house again, and judging by the flickering quality of the light, they had started a fire. Frank had no telephone, and in any case, he had deeply mistrusted the police ever since they had taken him in for questioning about the Riddle's death. He put down the kettle at once, hurried back upstairs as fast as his bad leg would allow, and was soon back in his kitchen, fully dressed and removing the rusty old key from the hook by the door. He picked up his walking stick, which was propped against the wall, and set off into the night. The front door of the Riddle house bore no sign of being forced, nor did it have any windows. Frank limped around the back of the house until he reached a door almost completely hidden by ivy. He took out the old key, put it into the lock, and opened the door noiselessly. He had let himself into the cavernous kitchen. Frank had not entered it for many years. Nevertheless, although it was dark, he remembered where the door in the hall was, and he groped his way towards it. His nostrils were full of the smell of decay. His ears were pricked for any sounds of footsteps or voices from overhead. He reached the hall, which was a little lighter owing to the large mullioned windows on either side of the front door, and started to climb the stairs, blessing the dust which lay thick upon the stone, because it muffled the sound of his feet and stick. On the landing, Frank turned and at once saw where the intruders were. At the very end of the passage, a door stood ajar, and a flickering light shone through the gap, casting a long silver gold across the black floor. Frank edged closer and closer, grasping his walking stick firmly. Several feet from the entrance, he was able to see a narrow slice of the room beyond. The fire, he now saw, had been lit in the grate. This surprised him. He moved and listened intently for a man's voice within the room. It sounded timid and fearful. "There's a little more in the bottle, my lord, if you're still hungry." "Later," said a second voice. This too belonged to a man, but it was strangled and high-pitched and cold as a sudden blast of icy wind. Something about that voice made the sparse hairs on Frank's neck stand up. "Move closer to me, closer to the fire, Wormtail." Frank turned his right ear towards the door, the better to hear. There came the chink of a bottle being put down on some hard surface, and then the dull scraping noise of a heavy chair being dragged across the floor. Frank caught a glimpse of a small man, his back to the door, pushing the chair into place. He was wearing a long black coat, and there was a bald patch on the back of his head. Then he disappeared from sight again. "Where is Nagini?" said the cold voice. I don't know, my lord," said the voice nervously. "She set out to explore the house, I think." "You will milk her before we retire, Wormtail," said the second voice. "I will need feeding in the night. The journey has tired me greatly." Brow furrowed, Frank inclined his good ear still closer to the door, listening hard. There was a long pause, and the man called Wormtail spoke again. "My lord, may I ask how long we're going to stay here?" "A week," said the cold voice. "Perhaps longer." "My lord, may I ask how long we're going to stay?" "A week." Oh, sorry, I already read that. My kitty is getting crazy over here. Come here, Snuggles. "The place is more moderately comfortable, and the place we need to go, we cannot proceed yet. It would be foolish to act before the Quidditch World Cup is over." Look at my kitty. She keeps knocking our laptop around, so sorry guys if you're having a hard time hearing me or seeing me. "The Quidditch World Cup, my lord?" said Wormtail. Frank dug his fingers still more vigorously into his ear. "Forgive me, but I do not understand. Why should we wait until the World Cup is over?" "Because, fool, at this very moment, wizards are pouring into the country all over the world, and every meddler from the Ministry of Magic will be on duty, on the watch for signs of unusual activity, checking and double-checking identities. They will be obsessed with security, lest the muggles notice anything, so we wait." Frank stopped trying to clear his ear out. He had distinctly heard the words Ministry of Magic, wizards, and muggles. Plainly, each of these expressions meant something secret, and Frank could think of only two sorts of people who would speak in a code: spies and criminals. Frank tightened his hold on his walking stick once more and listened closely still. Your lordship is still determined, then?" Wormtail said quietly. "Certainly, I am determined, Wormtail." There was a note of menace in the cold voice now. A slight pause followed, and then Wormtail spoke the words, tumbling from him in a rush, as though he was forcing himself to say it before he lost his nerve. "It could be done without Harry Potter, my lord?" Another pause, more protracted, and then, "Without Harry Potter?" breathed the second voice softly. "I see." "My lord, I do not say this out of concern for the boy," said Wormtail, his voice rising squeakily. "The boy is nothing to me, nothing at all. It is merely that if we are to use another witch or wizard, any wizard, the thing could be done so much more quickly. If you allowed me to leave you for a short while, you know that I could disguise myself most effectively. I could be back here in as little as 2 days with a suitable person." "I could use another wizard," said the voice softly. "That is true." "My lord, it makes sense," said Wormtail, sounding relieved now. "Laying hands on Harry Potter could be so difficult. He's so well protected." "And so you volunteer to go and fetch me a substitute? I wonder. Perhaps the task of nursing me has become wearisome to you, Wormtail. Could this suggestion of abandoning the plan be nothing more than an attempt to desert me?" "My lord, I have no wish to leave you." "Do not lie to me," hissed the second voice. "I can always tell, Wormtail. You're regretting that you ever returned to me. I revolt you. I see the way you flinch when you look at me, when you shudder when you touch me. No, my devotion to your lordship. Your devotion is nothing more than cowardice. You would not be here if you had nowhere else to go. How am I supposed to survive without you feeding me every few hours? Who is to milk Nagini? But you seem so much stronger, my lord. Liar, breathed the second voice. I am no stronger, and a few days alone would be enough to rob me of a little health I've regained under your clumsy care. Silence! Wormtail, who had been sputtering incoherently, fell silent at once, and for a few seconds Frank could hear nothing but the crackling fire. Then the second man spoke once more, in a whisper that was almost a hiss. I have my reasons for using the boy, as I have already explained to you, and I will use no other. I've waited 13 years. A few more months will make no difference to me. As for the protection of the surrounding the boy, I believe my plan will be effective. And that is needed, and all that is needed, is a little courage from you, Wormtail. Courage you will find unless you wish to feel the full extent of Lord Voldemort's wrath. My lord, I must speak, said Wormtail, panic in his voice now. All through our journey I have gone over the plan in my head, my lord. Bertha Jorkin's disappearance will not go unnoticed for long, and if I curse, whispered the second voice, if you follow the plan, Wormtail, the ministry need never know that anyone else has disappeared. You will do it quietly and without fuss. I only wish that I could do it myself, but in my present condition— Come, Wormtail. One more obstacle removed and our path to Harry Potter is clear. I'm not asking you to do it alone. By that time, my faithful servant will have rejoined us. I am your faithful servant, said Wormtail, the merest trace of sullenness in his voice. Wormtail, I need someone with brains, someone whose loyalty has never wavered, and you unfortunately fulfill neither requirement. I found you, said Wormtail, and there was definitely a sulky edge to his voice now. I was the one who found you. I brought you Bertha Jorkins. That's true, said the second man, sounding amused. A stroke of brilliance I would have never thought possible from you, Wormtail. Although, if truth be told, you were not aware of how useful she would be when you caught her, were you? I thought she might be useful, my lord. Liar, the second voice said again. The cruel amusement had pronounced itself more than ever. However, I do not deny that her information was invaluable. Without it, I could have never formed our plan, and for that you will have a reward. Wormtail, I will allow you to perform an essential task for me, one that many of my followers would give their right hands to perform. Really, my lord? What? Ah, Wormtail, you don't want me to spoil the surprise. Your part will come at the very end, but I promise you, with the honor of being just as useful as Bertha Jorkins. You, Wormtail's voice sounded suddenly hoarse, as though his mouth had gone very dry. You were going to kill me too? Wormtail, Wormtail, said the cold voice silkily. Why would I kill you? I killed Bertha because I had to. She was fit for nothing after my questioning, quite useless. In any case, awkward questions would be asked if she had gone back to the ministry with the news that she had met you on her holidays. Wizards who are supposed to be dead do well not to run into the Ministry of Magic wizards or witches at the wayside inns. Wormtail muttered something so quietly that Frank could not hear it, but it made the second man laugh, an entirely mirthless laugh as cold as his speech. We could have modified her memory. But memory charms can be broken by a powerful wizard, as I proved when I questioned her. It would be an insult to her memory not to use the information I extracted from her, Wormtail. Out in the corridor, Frank suddenly became aware that the hand gripping his walking stick was slippery with sweat. The man with the cold voice had killed a woman. He was talking about it without any kind of remorse, with amusement. He was dangerous. He was a madman. And he was planning more murders. This boy, Harry Potter, whoever he was in danger. Frank knew what he must do. Now, if ever, was the time to go to the police. He would creep out of the house, head straight for the telephone box in the village. But the cold voice was speaking again, and Frank remained where he was, frozen to his spot, listening with all his might. One more curse, my faithful servant. One more curse. One more curse. Harry Potter is as good as mine, Wormtail. It is decided. There will be no more argument. But quiet, I think I hear Nagini. And the second man's voice changed. He started making noises such as Frank had never heard before. He was hissing and spitting without drawing breath. Frank thought he must be having some kind of fit or seizure. And then Frank heard movement behind him in the dark passageway. He turned to look behind him and found himself paralyzed with fright. Something was slithering towards him. He realized with a thrill of terror that it was a gigantic snake, at least 12 feet long. Horrified, transfixed, Frank stared at his undulating body, cut a wide curving track through the thick dust of the floor, coming closer and closer. What was he to do? The only means of escape was into the room where the two men sat plotting murder. Yet if he stayed where he was, that snake would surely kill him. Before he made the decision, the snake was level with him, and then, incredibly, miraculously, it was passing. It was following the spitting and hissing noises made by the cold voice beyond the door, and in seconds the tip of the diamond-patterned tail had vanished through the gap. There was sweat on Frank's forehead now, and the hand on the walking stick was trembling. Inside the room, the cold voice was continuing to hiss, and Frank had visited a strange idea, an impossible idea. This man could talk to snakes. Frank didn't understand what was going on. He wanted more than anything to be back in his bed with his hot water bottle. The problem was that his legs didn't want to move. As he stood there shaking and trying to master himself, the cold voice switched abruptly to English again. Nagini has interesting news, Wormtail, it said. Indeed, my lord, said Wormtail. Indeed, yes, said the voice. According to Nagini, there is an old muggle standing right outside this room, listening to every word we say. Frank didn't have a chance to hide himself. There were footsteps, and then the door of the room was flung open. A short, balding man with graying hair, a pointed nose, and small, watery eyes stood before him, a mixture of fear and alarm on his face. Invite him inside, Wormtail. Where are your manners? The cold voice was coming from the ancient armchair before the fire, but Frank still couldn't see the speaker. The snake, on the other hand, was curled up on the rotting hearth rug, like some horrible travesty of a pet dog. Wormtail beckoned Frank into the room. Okay, we're going to stop right there. I want you guys to make your predictions on our classroom thread for Chapter 1 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, and we will continue reading our book tomorrow. See you soon.